October 14, 1888. Northern Montana Territory. The mercury in the glass tube at the general store sat at a brittle 32 degrees Fahrenheit, but the real measurement of the day was the social temperature, which had dropped well below freezing. Thomas Miller stood on the porch of the Cattlemen's Association building, his boots worn thin but his posture as straight as a plumb line. Beside him stood his son, Robert, and Robert's wife, Martha, who held their 6-year-old son, Toby, close to her wool shawl. They had been told their lease on the valley bottom was terminated, effective immediately, to make room for a larger syndicate's grazing expansion. With exactly $42 in his pocket and a winter that usually arrived like a hammer by November, Thomas looked toward the limestone bluffs 3 miles to the north. Most men saw those cliffs as a barrier or a tomb, but Thomas saw them as a thermal battery. He had no time for the luxury of resentment. He had a math problem to solve involving calories, wind chill, and the thermal mass of rock. The deadline was not a date on a calendar, but the first deep pressure drop from the Arctic. They had roughly 21 days before the ground became iron and the air turned into a blade. The townspeople watched them with a mix of pity and the quiet satisfaction that comes from seeing a nonconformist fail. "You'll be frozen stiff before the first frost is off the pumpkins, Miller," the sheriff remarked, leaning against a post with a look of practiced indifference. Thomas didn't look back as he shouldered his pickaxe and shovel. "Nature doesn't care about your opinions, Sheriff, it only cares about your insulation," Thomas replied, his voice flat and certain. He knew that wood was a poor substitute for the Earth's own deep heat when the wind reached 40 miles per hour. They began the trek toward the bluffs, carrying only what mattered: steel tools, a few sacks of grain, and the collective memory of how to stay alive when the world wants you dead. The limestone face rose 80 feet above the scrub, a vertical desert that offered nothing to the eye but shadow. To the average settler, a home was a box made of pine boards, porous and drafty, requiring a constant sacrifice of chopped wood to maintain a fragile bubble of warmth. Thomas, however, understood the ledger of energy. He walked the base of the cliff until he found a natural indentation, a shallow alcove where the rock stayed dry. "We aren't building up, Robert," Thomas said, marking a line in the dirt that measured 12 feet by 20. "We're going in. The Earth stays at 55 degrees year-round if you go deep enough. That's a 40-degree head start against a blizzard." Robert looked at the solid stone and then at their single heavy pickaxe. "We'll break the steel before we break the mountain, Pa," he said, though he didn't stop offloading the packs. Martha set Toby down on a flat rock away from the work site, giving him a handful of dried apples to keep him occupied. "Just tell us where the line is, Thomas," she said, her jaw set. She knew that in this territory, pride was a secondary concern to the integrity of a roof. Thomas began the first strike at 10:15 a.m. The sound was a sharp, metallic ring that echoed across the empty basin. Every inch of progress was a calculated withdrawal from their physical bank account. By sunset, they had cleared only a foot of depth, a measly scratch against the mountain's ribs. A passing rider, a local ranch hand named Miller who had no relation but plenty of mockery, slowed his horse to watch. "Planning on burying yourselves early to save the undertaker the trouble," he shouted, his laughter thin in the cooling air. Thomas didn't look up from the rock face. "I'm building a bank, son," Thomas called back without breaking his rhythm. "I'm depositing heat now so I can withdraw it in January. You might want to start cutting more wood than you think you need." The rider snorted and trotted off, leaving the family in the deepening purple shadows of the bluff, their hands blistered and their lungs tasting of lime dust. By the 10th day, the cave reached a depth of 8 feet. The physics of the space were already beginning to manifest. While the outside air dipped to 18 degrees at night, the interior of the excavation remained stubbornly still and notably less biting. Thomas had designed the entrance with a deliberate dogleg turn, a baffle system he had seen in old mining records to prevent the wind from having a straight shot at the living quarters. He explained the mechanics to Robert as they hauled out the last of the day's rubble. "Air is like water, Robert. It wants to flow where there's the least resistance. We make the path hard for the cold, and easy for the heat to stay trapped in the ceiling." They weren't using wood for the walls because they didn't have to. The limestone provided a compressive strength that no timber frame could match. Martha had spent her days weaving heavy mats from dried slough grass to act as internal dividers, creating smaller pockets of air that would be easier to warm with body heat and a single small stove. At noon, a man named Henderson, a surveyor for the railroad who prided himself on his university education, rode up to the site. He carried a brass transit and a notebook full of formulas. The structural integrity of a cave in this type of sedimentary rock is dubious at best, Mr. Miller, Henderson said, peering into the gloom of the excavation. You're courting a cave-in for the sake of a few saved logs. Thomas wiped the sweat from his brow, despite the cold. I've measured the overhead, Mr. Henderson. 6 feet of solid caprock. I'll take the weight of the mountain over the weight of a snow-loaded roof any day. Tell me, what's the R-value of a pine board versus 8 feet of stone? Henderson blinked, his academic training failing to provide a quick retort for a man talking about thermal resistance in 1888. It's unconventional, Henderson muttered. So is surviving a Montana winter on $40, Thomas replied, turning back to his work. The interaction was a ledger entry in Thomas's mind, another man betting on tradition over the hard evidence of the physical world. The first snow arrived on November 3rd, a week earlier than the local almanac predicted. It wasn't the killing blow, just a warning shot of white powder that dusted the sagebrush. The Millers had finished the main chamber and were now installing the door, a heavy, double-layered affair made of salvaged crate wood and packed with wool scraps. Thomas had engineered a small ventilation shaft that rose at a 45-degree angle through a natural fissure, capped with a stone hood to keep the snow out. Inside, the family had moved their meager belongings. The floor was packed earth mixed with wood ash to create a hard, dry surface. It feels like a cellar, Pa, Toby said, his voice echoing slightly in the stone room. It's supposed to, son, Thomas told him, kneeling down to show the boy how the air moved near the floor. A cellar stays cool in summer and warm in winter because the earth has a long memory. It remembers the sun from 3 months ago. Martha lit a single tallow candle, and the light reflected off the white limestone walls, making the small space feel surprisingly expansive. Outside, the temperature began its inevitable slide toward the 0 mark. They had managed to stack 3 cords of wood inside the baffle entrance, kept bone dry by the rock. This was their fuel reserve, but Thomas calculated they would only need 1/3 of what a standard cabin consumed. He sat at the small table, recording their daily measurements in a ledger, outside 12 degrees Fahrenheit, inside 48 degrees Fahrenheit, no fire lit. The math was holding. However, the social pressure hadn't relented. A delegation from the town, led by the same status-conscious rancher who had evicted them, arrived in a sturdy carriage just before the drifts became impassable. They wanted to offer a charity spot in a drafty barn back in town, mostly to clear their own consciences. You can't keep a woman and a child in a hole in the ground like animals, the rancher said, refusing to step out into the cold. It's a matter of public decency. Thomas stood at the mouth of his cave, the warmth of the earth radiating against his back. Decency won't keep my grandson's toes from turning black, Mr. Vance. This hole, as you call it, is currently 30 degrees warmer than your carriage. We'll stay with the stone. By mid-December, the big one arrived. The sky turned the color of a bruised plum before disappearing entirely into a wall of white. This wasn't just a storm, it was a pressurized event, a polar vortex that sent the temperature screaming down to -30 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind hit 70 miles per hour, stripping the paint off any exposed wood in the valley. In town, the standard-built houses groaned under the weight of the drifts, their inhabitants huddled around roaring fireplaces that sucked more heat out through the chimneys than they provided to the rooms. But at the limestone bluff, the Miller family lived in a different reality. The cave was silent. The screaming wind was reduced to a faint hum through the stone. Thomas kept the small stove at a low simmer, burning only for small splits of wood every 6 hours. The ledger now read, outside -34 degrees Fahrenheit, inside 62 degrees Fahrenheit. They were living in shirt sleeves while the world outside was dying. Martha sat in the corner, sewing by the steady light of a lamp, while Robert worked on repairing a harness. There was no desperation here, only the quiet efficiency of a system that worked. On the 3rd day of the blizzard, a frantic pounding came at the heavy door. Robert pulled it open to find 2 men, nearly frozen into statues, their horses lost to the whiteoat. It was the sheriff and the surveyor, Henderson. They were grey-faced, their eyelashes thick with ice. "We couldn't make it to the line shack," the sheriff wheezed, stumbling into the warmth. He stopped, his mouth hanging open as he felt the steady, radiating heat of the limestone. He looked at the thermometer hanging on the wall and then at the small, modest fire in the stove. "How is it this warm in here?" Henderson asked, his voice trembling as his limbs began to thaw. "I told you, Mr. Henderson," Thomas said, handing them each a tin mug of hot broth. "The mountain is a battery. It's been soaking up the sun all summer, and now it's giving it back to us. You're not standing in a hole, you're standing inside a thermal equilibrium." The skeptics sat in silence, the moral sting of their previous ridicule replaced by the overwhelming, measurable proof of their survival. The cave wasn't a sign of poverty, it was a masterpiece of frontier engineering. The storm raged for 6 consecutive days, a relentless kinetic assault that buried the valley under 4 feet of crystalline white. Inside the limestone chamber, the passage of time was marked not by the sun, but by the rhythmic ticking of Thomas's pocket watch and the steady, low-consumption burn of the stove. The sheriff and Henderson sat on the stone benches Thomas had carved into the walls, their initial embarrassment replaced by a profound, humbled curiosity. "I've spent 20 years in this territory," the sheriff admitted, watching Toby play quietly with a set of smooth river stones on the warm floor. "I've seen men burn through 10 cords of wood in a month and still wake up with ice in their wash basins. This is something else entirely." Henderson was busy scribbling in his notebook, no longer recording criticisms, but measurements. He noted the thickness of the door, the angle of the ventilation shaft, and the way the limestone walls felt slightly warm to the touch. "It's the lag effect," Henderson whispered, more to himself than the others. "The rock is so thick that the cold of December won't even reach the center of this wall until March. By then, the spring sun will be fighting it back." Thomas nodded, sipping his coffee. "It's a simple ledger, Mr. Henderson. If you stop fighting nature and start using her momentum, the math shifts in your favor. We aren't surviving the mountain, we're letting the mountain protect us." The 2 men, who had once looked down on the millers as social outcasts, now looked at them as masters of a craft they hadn't even realized existed. The crisis had stripped away the veneer of status, leaving only the cold reality of who was prepared and who was merely lucky. Outside, the wind shrieked, but inside, the only sound was the soft crackle of a fire that didn't need to fight for its life. On the 7th day, the wind finally broke, leaving a world of blinding white and absolute silence. The drifts had covered the cave entrance entirely, but Thomas had anticipated this. He had built a secondary exit through the ventilation shaft, a series of recessed footholds in the rock that allowed him to climb out and shovel the main door clear from the outside. When the heavy door finally swung open, a wall of cold air tried to rush in, but the dogleg baffle he had engineered caught the brunt of it, swirling the frost into a harmless eddy. The sheriff and Henderson stepped out into the blinding light, squinting against the glare. Their horses were gone, likely huddled in some lee of the hills, but the men were alive. "We owe you our lives, Miller," the sheriff said, his voice gruff with a genuine respect that hadn't been there a week ago. "I'll be sending a team back with your horses and some supplies as soon as the trails are broken. And I'll be telling the association that they were fools to let you go." Thomas didn't smile, he merely checked the sky for the next pressure system. "Don't send supplies as a favor, Sheriff. Send them as a trade. I've got the blueprints for this place in my head, and I reckon there are a lot of families in the valley who won't make it through the next one if they keep living in pine boxes." Henderson looked back at the cliff face, which now looked less like a tomb and more like a fortress. "I want to help you document this, Thomas. The thermal properties, the ventilation, it needs to be a standard. We've been building for the East Coast in a land that demands the West." As the 2 men began the long, difficult trek back toward town, Thomas watched them go, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He knew the social reversal had begun. That hole in the ground, it was about to become the most sought-after architecture in the territory. News of that stone fortress spread through the valley faster than the thaw. By late January, the very people who had mocked the Millers were making the pilgrimage to the bluffs. They didn't come with insults this time, they came with questions and measuring tapes. The status-conscious rancher, Mr. Vance, was among the last to arrive. He stood in the center of the cave, his expensive fur coat looking ridiculous in the practical, efficient warmth of the limestone room. He looked at the thermometer, which stayed at a steady 58 degrees despite the 10 below weather outside. "I lost 40 head of cattle and 2 of my hands got frostbite in their bunkhouse," Vance said, his voice stripped of its usual arrogance. "My own house cost $4,000 to build, and we had to huddle in the kitchen for a week just to keep from freezing." Thomas sat at his table, cleaning a lantern globe. "A high price doesn't buy physics, Mr. Vance. You built a monument to your bank account." "I built a response to the environment." Vance looked around the room, his eyes lingering on the simple, handmade furniture and the lack of decorative flourishes. "I want to build 3 of these at my winter line camps. I'll pay you to oversee the blasting and the layout." Thomas looked at his son, Robert, who was teaching Toby how to read by the light of the stove. "I'm not a contractor, Vance. But I am a neighbor. I'll show your men how to do it, provided the knowledge stays free for anyone else who needs it. We aren't going to turn survival into a monopoly." The room was silent for a moment as the weight of Thomas's moral thesis settled in. In a land defined by scarcity, the only true wealth was the kind you could share without losing any yourself. The transition from outcasts to teachers happened over the course of a single spring. As the snow melted and the ground softened, the bluffs became a hive of activity. Thomas didn't just give orders, he explained the why behind every move. He taught the young men of the valley how to read the grain of the rock, how to calculate the necessary overhead for structural safety, and how to use the Earth's natural fissures for air circulation. "You're looking for the balance point," Thomas would say, pointing to a cross-section of the dig. "Too shallow and you're just in a cold cellar. Too deep and you lose the ventilation. You want to be right in the sweet spot where the Earth's heartbeat matches your own." Martha and Robert were just as involved, showing the families how to seal the stone against moisture and how to manage the internal airflow to prevent dampness. Even Toby, in his own way, became a witness to the change, showing the other children how the warm rocks worked. By the time the first heat of summer hit, 6 new cave homes were under construction along the ridge. The community was no longer a collection of isolated, vulnerable boxes, it was becoming a network of integrated, resilient shelters. The town's general store even started stocking the specific heavy-duty pickaxes and lime ceiling compounds Thomas recommended. The Vermiller method wasn't just a way to build a house, it was a shift in the local culture, a move away from the pride of the visible and toward the competence of the functional. The ledger of the valley was changing, and for the first time, the balance was moving into the black. September 1889. 1 year after the eviction. Thomas Miller sat on a stone bench outside his home, watching the sun dip behind the peaks. The temperature was already dropping, a familiar bite in the air that signaled the coming winter. But this year, there was no fear in the valley. There were now 12 cave dwellings along the bluffs, their stone hoods poking out from the hillside like the chimneys of a subterranean village. A local newspaper from Great Falls had even sent a reporter to interview the Cave King of Montana, a title Thomas found dryly amusing. "It's not about being a king," Thomas told the reporter, his voice recorded in the man's shorthand notes. "It's about being a student. We spent too long trying to conquer this land with wood and nails. We finally learned to listen to what the geology was telling us." The reporter asked if he missed the dignity of a proper house. Thomas looked back at his door, where Martha was calling them in for supper, the warm glow of the interior spilling out into the twilight. Dignity is being able to sleep through a blizzard knowing your family won't wake up cold. Dignity is having the math on your side when the world turns to ice. The legacy of the Miller family wasn't written in marble or gold, but in the measurable survival of an entire community. The records of the local doctor showed a 70% drop in respiratory illnesses that winter, and the livestock losses were the lowest in a decade. As Thomas stepped inside and closed the heavy, insulated door, the click of the latch sounded like a final verdict. The crisis had been the teacher, and the mountain had been the classroom. The lesson was simple: survival isn't a romantic myth, it's a series of correct decisions made under pressure. And in the high territories, the most correct decision you can make is to remember that the earth has already provided the solution, if you're humble enough to dig for it.